South Korea today exports more cultural influence per square mile than almost any nation on Earth. Its entertainment dominates global streaming platforms. Its technology powers devices on every continent. Its food, fashion, and philosophy have quietly infiltrated daily life from Sao Paulo to Stockholm. And most people, when asked why, point to the last 30 years, to Samsung, to BTS, to the Korean wave. But here's what that answer misses entirely. Korea didn't become extraordinary in the late 20th century. It was extraordinary 1,000 years earlier. Centuries before the West had a printing press, Korea had movable metal type. Centuries before European navies developed ironclad warships, Korea launched them into battle. While Florence was celebrating its renaissance, a Korean king was engineering one of the most scientifically sophisticated writing systems ever designed, from scratch. The question isn't why Korea is impressive today. The question is why it took the world this long to notice what was there all along. The story Western textbooks tell about Korea is usually the same. A peninsula caught between giants, shaped by China, occupied by Japan, saved by America. A country whose history is largely a footnote to someone else's story. And there's a kernel of truth to it. Geography is destiny, and Korea's position between the great powers of East Asia meant it was perpetually subject to outside pressure. But here's what that framing misses. Pressure doesn't only crush, sometimes it forges. Korea didn't absorb Chinese civilization passively. It filtered it, refined it, and in multiple cases, improved it. It developed technologies independently that the rest of the world hadn't imagined. It built institutional structures, medical systems, astronomical observatories, civil examination frameworks that rivaled anything in the medieval world. And it did this while maintaining a distinct cultural identity that refused, over and over again, to be dissolved by more powerful neighbors. Most people think Korea's significance is modern, but here's what they miss. Korea's modernity is built on a foundation of ancient sophistication that was never properly recognized outside the peninsula itself. We're going to examine 4 specific domains where Korea wasn't just keeping pace with the world, it was ahead of it. Printing, scientific governance, ceramic artistry, naval engineering. 4 fields, 4 examples of a civilization working at a level the West wouldn't reach for generations. Once you see this pattern, Korea's present starts to make a different kind of sense. In 1234 AD, Korean craftsmen did something that wouldn't happen in Europe for another 200 years. They printed books using movable metal type. Johannes Gutenberg is credited with revolutionizing communication when his printing press appeared in the 1440s. History books celebrate this as the moment mass information became possible. The precondition for the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment. Gutenberg changed everything, the story goes. Except Korea had already done it. The Goryeo dynasty, a kingdom that ruled the Korean peninsula from 918 to 1392, developed the world's first metal movable type printing system under the reign of King Gojong. The oldest surviving book printed with this technology is the Jikji, compiled in 1377, which predates Gutenberg by 78 years. But the technology itself was in use even earlier, sometime in the early 13th century. This wasn't an accident of isolated tinkering. It was the product of a court that understood the strategic value of information. The Goryeo dynasty was under constant pressure, from the Khitan in the north, from the Mongols who would eventually conquer them, and knowledge preservation was treated as a form of national survival. When Mongol invasions destroyed the first set of Buddhist wooden printing blocks, Korean craftsmen didn't just rebuild them. They spent 16 years carving 81,000 new wood blocks, the Tripitaka Koreana, with such precision that scholars today consider them among the most accurate Buddhist texts ever produced. The movable type system emerged from this same culture of information as infrastructure. Korea's printing innovations weren't curiosities. They were expressions of a civilization that treated the written word as foundational to stability, governance, and identity. The parallel to today is direct. South Korea has one of the highest literacy rates on Earth. Its education system is among the most rigorous globally. Its publishing, gaming, and entertainment industries are built on a cultural reverence for knowledge production that stretches back 8 centuries. This isn't coincidence, it's continuity. Here's where it gets interesting. While Europe was still hand-copying manuscripts in monasteries, Korea had already solved the industrialization of text. The question isn't why Korea was advanced. The question is why that advancement was filed away as a minor footnote to Gutenberg's story rather than recognized as the original chapter. Most people associate the 15th century Renaissance with Florence. Michelangelo, Leonardo, Botticelli, a flowering of art, science, and humanism that transformed Western civilization. And it was remarkable. But something equally extraordinary was happening simultaneously, 6,000 miles east, in the Korean kingdom of Joseon. King Sejong the Great ruled from 1418 to 1450. In the West, he is almost unknown. In Korea, he appears on the 10,000 won banknote and is considered the greatest ruler in the nation's history. The reason comes down to two things: a writing system and a court of science. Let's start with Hangul. In 1443, Sejong and a royal research institution called the Hall of Worthies, scholars he had assembled specifically to solve problems, created an entirely new writing system from philosophical first principles. This was not adaptation. This was invention. Hangul was designed so that Korean consonants visually represent the shape the mouth makes when producing them. It was scientifically engineered for learnability. Sejong's stated goal was literacy for ordinary people, not just elites, and historians estimate the system can be learned to basic proficiency in a matter of days. Linguists today rank Hangul among the most logically designed writing systems ever created. The British linguist Geoffrey Sampson called it one of the great intellectual achievements of humankind. Korea's literacy rate today consistently ranks at or near 100%. That's not accidental. It's the long downstream consequence of a 15th century design decision. But Sejong's court didn't stop at language. Under his direction, Korean scientists developed the rain gauge, the world's first standardized instrument for measuring rainfall. In 1441, almost 200 years before similar devices appeared in Europe, they built astronomical clocks, sundials, and water-powered timekeeping mechanisms. They cataloged thousands of medicinal herbs in the Hyangyak Jipseongbong, a medical encyclopedia designed to make Korean medicine independent of Chinese pharmaceutical supply chains. This last point deserves emphasis. The Joseon court wasn't just accumulating knowledge, it was strategically indigenizing knowledge, making Korea self-sufficient in science and medicine, reducing dependency on external expertise. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in Korean history. Absorb from outside, then internalize, refine, and own. Sound familiar? Today, South Korea's TSMC competitor Samsung Foundry, its pharmaceutical manufacturing ambitions, its push for domestic semiconductor independence, these are modern expressions of a 600-year-old civilizational instinct. The drive for self-sufficiency isn't a Cold War lesson, it's a Joseon inheritance. Sejong's 15th century court was, by any meaningful definition, a renaissance. It just wasn't in Europe. And because it wasn't in Europe, it didn't get called one. There is a color called Goryeo Celadon green, and for roughly 3 centuries, no civilization on Earth could replicate it. Celadon pottery, ceramic glazed in pale blue-green tones, was originally a Chinese innovation, developed during the Tang and Song dynasties. The Chinese were justifiably proud of it. Then Korean potters in the Goryeo period took the technique, studied it, and did something that left Chinese craftsmen stunned. They made it better. The specific shade produced by Goryeo kilns, a translucent jade-like blue-green that seemed to hold light inside it, was described by a 12th century Chinese official named Xu Jing as the finest ceramic art he had ever encountered. He wrote that the Korean Celadon color was simply the most beautiful in the world. This was not a diplomatic compliment. It was a professional assessment from someone whose own civilization had invented the art form. What made Goryeo Celadon remarkable wasn't just aesthetic. Korean potters developed inlay techniques, called songgam, that allowed them to embed white and black clay patterns beneath the glaze, creating decorations of extraordinary delicacy. This technique had no equivalent in Chinese ceramics. It was purely Korean innovation. Cranes, clouds, lotus flowers, pressed into the clay before firing, visible through the glaze like images beneath still water. The tragedy of Goryeo Celadon is instructive. When the Mongol invasions devastated the peninsula in the 13th century, the kiln communities were dispersed, the craftsmen scattered, the specific knowledge of those particular clay compositions and firing temperatures lost. The color was never exactly reproduced again. Modern Korean potters have spent generations attempting reconstruction, and the results are beautiful. But historians believe the original shade remains, technically, unmatched. This matters beyond art history. It illustrates something about how civilizational knowledge works. Sophistication is fragile. It can be built over centuries and lost in a decade of upheaval. It doesn't fossilize into the historical record easily, especially when the civilization that produced it doesn't control the historiography, the story writing, that comes afterward. Korea's ceramic tradition continued through the Joseon period, pivoting toward white porcelain, buncheong ware, that influenced Japanese pottery so profoundly that Japanese potters were forcibly taken from Korea during the 1590s invasions specifically to replicate their skills. Japan literally kidnapped Korean ceramic expertise. The artisans taken during those invasions are credited with founding several of Japan's most famous pottery traditions. Korea's cultural exports, in other words, were sometimes extracted by force long before the term soft power existed. When the Japanese military commander Toyotomi Hideyoshi launched his invasion of Korea in 1592, he expected fast conquest. His armies had just unified Japan through decades of brutal civil war. They were battle-hardened, well-armed, and confident. The Korean peninsula, they assumed, was a corridor to China. What they encountered in the Yellow Sea stopped them cold. Admiral Yi Sun-sin, possibly the most tactically brilliant naval commander in East Asian history, met the Japanese fleet with a pawn they had never seen, the turtle ship, or Geobukseon. These were warships covered with iron plates and wooden spikes, designed to be rammed into enemy vessels without being boarded. Oars below the waterline provided propulsion independent of wind. The prow was shaped like a dragon's head, which fired cannon and, by some historical accounts, released smoke to obscure the ship's position. This was, functionally, an ironclad warship. The Western naval history books credit the American Civil War, specifically the USS Monitor versus CSS Virginia engagement of 1862, as the birth of ironclad naval combat. The turtle ship predated that by 270 years. Yi Sun-sin's record across 23 naval engagements during the Imjin War, 23 victories, 0 defeats. At the Battle of Myeongyang in 1597, he defeated a Japanese fleet of approximately 133 ships with 13 Korean vessels. The tactical improvisation required to achieve that outcome, using tidal currents, narrow straits, and precise timing, is studied in military academies today. The modern resonance is direct. South Korea today fields one of the most sophisticated naval forces in the Asia-Pacific. Its shipbuilding industry, Hyundai Heavy Industries, Samsung Heavy Industries, Daewoo Shipbuilding, produces more commercial tonnage than almost any nation on Earth. South Korea builds approximately 40% of the world's large ships by gross tonnage. This is not coincidence. This is a peninsula that has always understood that its survival is maritime, and that the sea is both its greatest vulnerability and its greatest strategic asset. Yi Sun-sin didn't just win battles, he preserved a civilization. Without his victories at sea, Japanese supply lines would have stretched unimpeded to China, and Korea as a political entity might have ceased to exist. The Korean peninsula's continued independence, which made its later cultural and technological development possible, owes a significant debt to innovations in naval engineering that the West wouldn't approach for centuries. Here's the pattern that runs beneath all of it. Korea's advancements didn't emerge despite its geography. They emerged because of it. A civilization that is perpetually pressured by Mongols from the north, by Chinese cultural gravity from the west, by Japanese ambition from the east, faces a choice. It can dissolve, it can resist, or it can do what Korea repeatedly did, absorb the pressure, convert it into ingenuity, and produce something the pressure-applying civilization hadn't managed itself. Movable metal type emerged from a culture that understood information preservation as national security. Hangul emerged from a ruler who understood that literacy was power and that a people who couldn't read their own language were permanently dependent. The turtle ship emerged from a naval commander who understood that technological asymmetry could compensate for numerical inferiority. Goryeo Celadon emerged from craftsmen who took someone else's art form and refined it past the point its originator could follow. Notice the common thread. Each innovation is a form of sovereignty, not military sovereignty. Korea was often militarily overwhelmed, but civilizational sovereignty, the insistence on being distinctly irreducibly Korean, on developing internal capacities rather than remaining permanently derivative, on converting external knowledge into something owned. This is also why the Western failure to recognize these achievements isn't entirely a matter of ignorance. It's partly structural. The historiography of world history was largely written by European scholars in the 18th and 19th centuries, at the peak of colonial confidence, in a framework that treated European development as the central story and everyone else as peripheral characters. Korea, not colonizing, not trading heavily with Europe, not appearing in Western textbooks except as a geographical footnote between China and Japan, simply didn't get filed into the main narrative. But here's what complicates this. Korean scholars and courts weren't particularly concerned with Western recognition either. The Joseon dynasty operated within a Sino-centric world order in which China was the acknowledged center of civilization, and Korea's relationship with that center was what defined prestige. The invisibility to Europe was mutual. What changed, what made Korea's invisibility become a distortion worth correcting, is that the world's framework for what counts as significant shifted. And Korea, which had been quietly building for a millennium, suddenly found itself very relevant indeed. A civilization can be extraordinary and invisible at the same time. That's not a contradiction. It's a condition created by who controls the story. For centuries, Korea's achievements were documented. In Korean archives, in Chinese official histories, in the admiring accounts of foreign visitors who encountered their ceramics and their scholarship. The knowledge existed. What didn't exist was a global framework that treated Korea's peninsula as a center rather than a margin. The West realized Korea was advanced when Korean goods flooded global markets, when Korean films won Academy Awards, when Korean technology appeared inside the devices everyone carried. But the realization was backward. The sophistication wasn't new, it was continuous. What was new was the world's attention. Which raises a genuinely uncomfortable question for how we study history. How many other civilizations are still waiting for that attention? How many printing revolutions, naval innovations, scientific courts are sitting in archives that Western academia hasn't prioritized, in languages that the dominant historiography hasn't centered? Korea got its recognition partly because of deliberate cultural projection. The Korean wave was partly natural and partly government-supported strategy. Other civilizations may not have had the same combination of modern state capacity and ancient foundation to achieve the same visibility. So when you stream a Korean drama, use a Korean phone, or encounter a Korean restaurant in your city, you're not watching a sudden cultural emergence. You're seeing the surface of something very deep, a civilization that was printing books when Europe was still hand-copying them. That was building ironclad ships when Western navies still relied on wood and wind. That designed a writing system so logical it can be learned in a weekend. The West didn't make Korea advanced. Korea was advanced. The West just finally started paying attention. What does it say about the stories we tell ourselves? About progress, about civilization, about who gets to be called innovative? That it took this long? That's worth sitting with.